Cool.
Fair enough. Everybody getting up.
Thanks. This talk is about work we did in the GNOME 46 or GLib 2.80 cycle. It's to move some of the gobject-introspection code into GLib and to stabilize its APIs. Emanuele did a talk yesterday about these changes from the point of view of introspection annotations and library APIs, and it was good. You should watch the talk recording if you haven't seen it already, if you're interested in this stuff. If you're not interested in this stuff, like, please leave now. It's not that great. But I'll be talking about it from the point of view of GLib for apps, language bindings, and distributions. The work for this, for the merge, was funded by the Sovereign Tech Fund last year, and it was to help with keeping our fundamental infrastructure up to date. So I'll go through what the problems were with the old arrangement and what we changed and how it impacts on you if you're involved in apps or bindings or documentation or distribution packaging. So when gobject-introspection was started as a project, it was kind of deliberately started outside of the GLib Git tree to allow it to incubate and kind of the space to be explored and people to work out what made sense and what worked and what didn't. But the idea always was to eventually merge it into GLib, and now, like, over a decade later, we've kind of done that, finally. The previous status quo of having it out of tree worked okay, but it made for fairly slow iteration. So the introspection data for GLib was generated in the gobject-introspection build, which was a separate module, so it had to be periodically kind of manually updated from GLib and then rebuilt, and then the GR files would end up in the wrong build tree. And that sort of cycle was, it made for a lot of busy work. It also meant that GLib couldn't use any of the introspection data internally, for example, for building documentation, which didn't used to be that relevant because we were using GTK-doc, but times move on, GTK-doc became deprecated, and now we have other tools like GeoDocument, which use introspection data for building a documentation, so it becomes more relevant. So what is gobject-introspection? What is the project formed of, in case you don't know already? So it's got various libraries and formats and utilities. They come together to allow you to basically take a C library, scan its source code to extract API definitions, which, as Emanuele was at pains to say, is not a sort of verbatim representation of the C API. It's a slightly higher level than that. And you do that using GIR scanner, and that produces a GIR, which is an XML file. You can then use GIR compiler to compile that GIR file into a typelib file, which is a binary format. And then language bindings load those typelib files when you import a module at runtime in your app. And finally, libgi repository, which is the library part of it, provides programmatic access to read and to write typelib files. So most bindings don't actually have a source for that. At least some bindings use libgi repository to read the typelib files when you import a module. If they don't, they better have some good reasons for it because it would probably make their lives easier. And GIR compiler uses it to generate typelib files. So why don't we just move all of gobject-introspection.git into GLib and be done, right? It's not that straightforward, unfortunately. GIR scanner, which, as I just said, is the piece that parses your C source and extracts your API definitions and generates your GIR XML files. It's written in a mixture of all sorts of things, CPython, Python, Flex, Bison, and in particular it needs Python development headers to be built. So adding that as a dependency to GLib, which is pretty low level on your system, is it's a big move that we wouldn't do. It would introduce too many additional dependencies. So we cannot just take all of those three and bung them into that box over there. It's not going to work. Approach number two. Well, no, that's the thing I just said. That's what happens when you rewrite your slides. Approach number two, we can take some of those things and move them into box over there and leave some of them in the box on the left. And this is the approach we actually took. It basically means moving half of gobject-introspection to GLib. So the libgi repository and GIR compiler move over. GIR scanner with its dependency tree stays where it is for the time being, at least. So this means we've essentially split the introspection pipeline into, on the left, the parts which generate the GIR files, and on the right, the parts which consume the GIR files and turn them into other things and allow loading your typelib files. So there have been no changes to the typelib or the GIR file formats. So the tools and libraries from before we did the move and after we did the move should be completely interoperable on that front, which should make things a whole lot easier for this transition. We have, however, made a number of API changes to the library, libgi repository, and the utilities which use it. So GIR compiler. No, there's a typo on that. Oh dear. Yeah, we've renamed some of the utilities and we've changed the library API versions. So in particular, one of the big changes we made was to change the homegrown type system in a libgi repository into something like slightly more standard using gtype instance, which is kind of fixing up some historical mistakes, I suppose. The new versions of things, the library and the utilities, are all parallel installable with the old versions. So consumers of the old versions can continue to use the old versions. People who want to switch to the new versions can continue to use those, and they can both interoperate on the same system. And the old versions will continue to be shipped with gobject-introspection releases for the time being. The API changes are all documented in a migration guide without typos, like what I just had on the previous slide. Bonus points if you can spot that. But yeah, this is the canonical reference for what to do about migrating your use of the utilities or the library APIs or packaging or anything like that. Just go there and it should answer any questions. And basically means this talk is redundant. So what does this mean for you if you're an app author? Basically nothing, you don't need to do anything. None of the pipeline for building GIR files has changed. While the pipeline for building a typelib file from a GIR file has changed, like we've changed GIR compiler to GI compiler repository, there's no pressing need to switch from one to the other. It's probably easiest to just stick with whatever your build system makes it easy to use, which for Meson is the old GIR compiler using GNOME.generate GIR down there. For bindings, if you're a binding developer, you also don't need to do anything immediately, but you may want to put an item on your roadmap for porting to the new version of libgi repository. Because of the API changes that we've done in it, it'll require quite a lot of small changes to your binding code. Small ones, but all over the place, which will probably make it infeasible to support both the old and the new versions at the same time with ifdefs. It'd be too many ifdefs. So it's probably best to just switch wholesale at some point. But because the typelib format hasn't changed, you don't need to coordinate this switch with any other modules or distros or anything, just do it when it suits. Switching to the new version should mean that you end up with cleaner code overall because of the improvements we've made, but if you find parts of the API which are still awkward or you've got suggestions for how to improve it, then please file an issue against GLib and let us know and we can see what we can do about it. If you are a distro packager, it's a little bit more involved, but it shouldn't be too bad, hopefully. All of the details you really need to know are included in the release notes for GLib 2.79 and 2.80, so that should be your first port of call rather than me talking about it now. The addition of the new version of the library should be fairly straightforward because it's just another parallel installable library. There's plenty of examples of this happening at previous points in history in GNOME. So just package both versions in parallel and eventually you'll want to drop the old one from your distribution once enough clients and users of it have ported. The changes to how GLib is built are a little bit more involved. So in order to generate the inspection data for GLib entry, you now need to build GLib once without introspection support, then build gobject-introspection to get GIR scanner, and then rebuild GLib with introspection support, and that'll build glib.gir and allow you to build the documentation for GLib. So this is a pretty classic example of a bootstrapping build in packaging. There are other examples of it in distros already. It does make things more complicated, we're sorry, but there's not really a way around it. But yeah, get in touch with us by filing an issue against GLib if this is problematic somehow, and we'll see what we can do to help. For us, as the people who maintain GLib, this kind of makes our CI and build system somewhat more complicated as well, because we have to do this bootstrapping sequence. We also now have to be careful about providing overrides within the build system for the introspection tools that we use. But on the flip side, it does mean we've been able to port the documentation to GI.docgen. So now the GLib documentation on docs.gnome.org matches all of the other nice modern documentation, and it should be getting better over time as well. And that's kind of one of the big user visible features for us out of this STF work. So what is next? For now, this is the end of the big rearrangements, and any work, at least that I've got planned to do on this, will be kind of stabilization. So for example, adding more unit tests, because libgi repository has historically not had many, even though it's used in a lot of apps and a lot of bindings. Porting the glib documentation to GI.docgen has been done at a high level, and it's there and it's on the website and in use. But there's still a lot of individual documentation comments which need syntax porting and formatting, polishing and tweaking and rewriting to follow new conventions. So help is very welcome on that, and it's something that we'd very much encourage people to do. If you're reading a little bit of documentation for whatever you're working on and you see some problems with it, then just throw a merge request at us to improve it, and over time we can just iterate through them and make them more better. The scanner side of gobject-inspection is now going to get louder and more opinionated, and for that I will refer you to Emanuele's talk from yesterday, which he explains it in more detail and the rationale for it. So that is that. There's some maybe useful links there, and in case I've not explained that very well, any questions? One question. I can repeat it. Okay, I won't repeat it.
Hi, so thanks, first of all, for doing a lot of work. But you mentioned that the GIR scanner is currently in the GI repository, but that there might be some ideas for doing something else with it? Or it's more of a...
Yeah, as I said, for the moment, this is all I've planned to do, but Emanuele is waving, so maybe talk to him about it, or pass the mic over if he wants to speak about it now.
The main problem, as Philip said, that the scanner is written in mostly Python, but it has a C declaration parser that is flex Python and C, essentially. So it's built as a Python module, which means that you have to build glib that would... Anything that builds it has to know how to build Python modules. There is an option of porting the current parser with to a pure Python C declaration parser. There is a merge request that is very experimental. It still has a bunch of problems. It solves a bunch of problems. It introduces a bunch of other problems. It's not particularly fun. The other problem is that the scanner has to, as I said in my talk, has to generate a little bit of C code, compile it, and run it in order to then extract all the type information, which is another pain, and that is another problematic part, and it needs to be solved. I have a few ideas on how to solve it, but it's a very long-term project. So for the time being, gobject-introspection will still contain and ship the introspection scanner. At some point might be solvable, but it's a long-term project. One option to solve the dependency cycle is to embed, so to make the gobject introspection scanner not depend on glib. So copy-paste a bunch of low-level types into gobject introspection, so you can build gobject introspection before you build glib without any problem. Yeah. It's long-term goals.
Does that answer everything? Cool. Any other questions? No, great. Thanks very much.